My name is Sutton. I am 31 years old, a lead financial risk analyst based in Boston, and until very recently, I believed that every liability could be managed if you simply had enough data. For a decade, my life has been defined by spreadsheets and mitigation strategies, predicting the collapse of markets before the first tremor hits. But on a rainy Saturday night in Newport, I realized I had failed to calculate the highest risk of all: the cost of my own mother's silence. My mother, Hester, wasn't invited to my wedding. It sounds like a headline, a piece of gossip for the Newport elite to chew on over gin and tonics. But to me, it was a necessary surgery. I didn't do it out of spite. I did it because I finally understood that some bonds aren't made of blood, but of debt. So, when she showed up at the ceremony flanked by 2 police officers holding a gift in the form of a DNA test meant to dismantle my life, I wasn't surprised. I was simply prepared. She wanted to prove I didn't belong to her. She thought that truth would ruin me. She didn't realize that a stranger was waiting in the back row to call her by a name she hadn't heard in 20 years. A name that carried a secret so dark it made her DNA paper look like a child's doodle. But before I tell you about the stranger or the wedding, you need to understand what kind of mother chooses a costume on a television screen over her daughter's freedom. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been the one left out in the cold while your family sat by the fire, stay with me. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Let's go back to October, to the night the first brick in the wall finally crumbled. It was 11:14 p.m. on a Saturday. The air in Newport was thick with the smell of salt and old damp wood. I was driving back from a site visit, the rhythmic swipe of my windshield wipers the only sound in the car. A blue light flickered in my rearview mirror, a routine traffic stop for a broken taillight. I wasn't worried until the officer returned to my window with a face as hard as flint. "Miss Sutton? There's an identity theft flag on your social security number," he said, his voice level but final. "Until we can verify your physical passport and birth certificate, I can't let you leave the precinct. It's an administrative hold." 20 minutes later, I was sitting on a cold steel bench in the Newport Police Department. The room smelled of industrial floor cleaner and stale, burnt coffee. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a headache-inducing frequency. I had 4% battery on my phone. My original documents were locked in a fireproof safe in the hallway of my mother's house, just 7 miles away. I am a woman who manages millions of dollars in international assets, yet in that moment, I was reduced to a subject because I lacked a specific piece of paper. I used my one phone call to dial Hester. I didn't ask for a lawyer. I didn't ask for her to bail me out. I asked for 20 minutes of her time to bring me the blue folder from the hall safe. "Hester, I'm at the station. There's a flag on my ID from an old error. I need that folder or I have to stay here until Monday morning. Please," I whispered, my voice echoing off the cinder block walls. In the background, I heard the muffled roar of a televised audience. A host was shouting. It was the finale of The Masked Singer. Hester's voice was thin, sharp, and utterly annoyed. "Sutton, it's 11:30. We've been waiting all season to see who the goldfish is. You're 31 years old. You're supposed to be the risk expert, aren't you? Figure it out yourself. I'm not driving in the rain to deal with your lack of organization. Don't ruin my night." She hung up. My phone buzzed once more before the screen went black. It was a notification from the family group chat. "Hester, Sutton is at the police station again, trying to get attention during the finale. Pathetic." My sister, Cressida, responded with a nail polish emoji and a laughing face. Classic Sutton. Always the victim when the spotlight isn't on her. Let her sit there. The desk sergeant, a man with tired, heavy eyes who had been listening to the exchange, looked away. He didn't say a word, but he adjusted his belt in visible discomfort and handed me a lukewarm cup of water in a paper cone. He had seen criminals, but he hadn't seen a mother choose a man in a plastic fish mask over her own child. His silence was a kindness. It validated that what I had just experienced was not normal. I didn't call her again. I didn't cry. I sat on that steel bench for 12 hours, watching the gray Newport dawn crawl up the walls. I sat there and I recalculated. I realized that for years I hadn't been an equal in that family. I had been an allowance. I was convenient as long as I was paying the Newport house's mortgage and handling the estate taxes. But the second I needed a return on that investment, the second I needed a mother, the account was empty. At 8 a.m., On Sunday, I used the station's landline to call a 24/7 private legal concierge service I pay $1,200 a year for. By 9:30 a.m., a bonded courier arrived with my secondary documents from my Boston vault, accompanied by a paralegal who cleared the flag in 10 minutes. It cost me $2,500 in emergency fees. It was worth every cent to realize that I didn't need Hester's permission to exist in the eyes of the law. Walking out into the crisp Sunday air, I felt a strange, quiet power. There is an old saying that you can't choose your family, but as a risk analyst, I know that you can choose which liabilities you carry. I opened my banking app as I walked to my car. My fingers were steady, my breathing deep. Action, recurring payment, Newport estate taxes, status, cancelled. Action, authorized user, Hester B. Status, deactivated. Action, authorized user, Cressida B. Status, deactivated. It wasn't an act of revenge, it was an act of self-respect. I wasn't being difficult or ungrateful. I was simply closing a branch of a business that had gone bankrupt. I didn't hate them, I just didn't owe them my life anymore. I felt the weight of a heavy, rusted chain finally snapping. I drove back to my studio in Boston and slept for 4 hours. When I woke up, there was a voicemail from a restricted number. A man's voice, raspy and formal, filled the quiet room. "Miss Sutton, my name is Thorne. I saw the flag on your social security number last night. I've been tracking that specific ID error for 20 years, waiting for someone to try and clear it. We need to talk about why your birth certificate doesn't actually exist in the state of Rhode Island. And we need to talk about who the woman you call Hester really is. Now, let me take you back to the winter of 2009. Newport, Rhode Island. The air was so sharp it felt like breathing glass, and the Atlantic was a bruised purple, crashing against the cliffs behind our house. That house, a sprawling red brick colonial with white pillars, was a monument to my mother's obsession with legacy. From the outside, it was a portrait of American stability. Inside, it was a museum of things you were never allowed to touch. In that house, love was a ranked commodity. My mother, Hester, was the architect of our hierarchy. She didn't value character, she valued social capital. My sister, Cressida, was the portrait, delicate, photogenic, and curated. I was the pillar, the one expected to hold up the roof while remaining invisible behind the velvet curtains. Our value wasn't determined by who we were, but by how we made Hester look to the Newport elite at Sunday brunch or the annual yacht club fundraiser. Cressida was the dream. She was impulsive, expensive, and constantly forgiven. Hester saw Cressida as a reflection of her own vanished youth, a second chance to be the center of every room. I was the duty. I was practical, high-achieving, and entirely managed. Hester didn't love me, she utilized me. I was the one who remembered the dry cleaning, the one who fixed the broken Wi-Fi, the one who made sure the bills disappeared before they became a conversation. She was celebrated. I was managed. I remember May of my senior year of high school. I had spent 4 years obsessing over my GPA, not because I loved the grades, but because I thought they were my ticket to a well-done Sutton. I received a letter in the mail, a full-ride academic scholarship to a prestigious university. My heart was hammered against my ribs when I showed Hester. I thought, finally, I have earned my place. Hester didn't even look up from her tea. She barely glanced at the gold-embossed seal. She just sighed, a sound like air escaping a tire. A scholarship, Sutton? Don't let the neighbors know. It makes us look needy. If you can't pay your own way like your sister's ballet tuition, it's a handout. It's unrefined. I felt the heat rise in my throat. I swallowed it. I told myself she was just stressed about the garden party. I convinced myself that being the strong one meant I didn't need the praise Cressida required to survive. 2 years later, for Cressida's 18th birthday, Hester planned a debutante-style gala. She spent 6 months obsessing over the floral arrangements and the weight of the cardstock for the invitations. I wasn't an invitee. I was the logistics coordinator. I spent the night in the shadows of the ballroom, managing the vendors, checking the coats, and ensuring the champagne stayed at exactly 42 degrees. I worked until my feet felt like they were bleeding inside my shoes. When I finally sat down for a moment in the darkened library to catch my breath, Hester found me. She didn't offer me a drink or ask if I'd eaten. She looked at me with a cold, clinical disappointment. "You look tired, Sutton. Your posture is sagging. Go to the kitchen and help the caterers clear the dessert plates. You're ruining the aesthetic of the front room. I stood up. I went to the kitchen. I cleared the plates. At the time, I told myself it made sense. Cressida was fragile. She needed the spotlight to keep from disappearing. I was strong. I could handle the cold. I convinced myself that being reliable was a higher calling than being loved. I didn't realize that in my family, being reliable was just another word for being a more efficient tool. I hadn't been forgotten. I had been erased from the family narrative, replaced by a functional version of myself that didn't require maintenance. The morning after I walked out of that Newport police station, the salt from the 12-hour holding cell was still on my skin. I didn't go home to sleep. The fatigue was a heavy coat, but the clarity was a bright, cold light. I walked through the gray, slushy streets of Boston until I reached the glass doors of my bank. I didn't want a coffee. I wanted the truth. I sat in a private cubicle with a young teller who looked at my wrinkled clothes and messy hair with quiet concern. I asked for the physical printouts, the last 5 years of our joint family accounts. These were the accounts I had been funding since my first promotion, the ones I thought were paying for Hester's modest medical needs, and Cressida's unfortunate career transitions. As the printer whirred, the ink still warm on the pages, I saw the pattern. My eyes scanned the rows of data with the precision of a risk analyst. I saw the thousands of dollars spent at luxury boutiques I had never entered. I saw the international flights to Paris and Milan I had never taken. I saw the emergency repairs for the Newport mansion. Over $40,000 in 2 years. But then, my fingers stopped on a specific entry, a wire transfer for a legal filing fee. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Boston wind. I realized then that the mansion Hester lived in, the one I had been paying the property taxes and HOA fees for, had been sold 3 years ago. Hester had sold the deed, pocketed the equity, and never told me. I had been paying the taxes on a house we no longer owned, essentially gifting the new anonymous holding company a free ride while Hester spent my savings on a lifestyle she hadn't earned. I sat there for a long time, the paper crinkling in my hand. The favoritism wasn't just an emotional ranking system, it was a business model. Hester wasn't just my mother. She was a silent partner who had been embezzling my future while telling me I was a burden for needing a passport. The Tuesday morning texts, the fake kindness, the "I'm so glad you're the responsible one." It was all harvesting. I looked at the teller. "I'd like to close these accounts," I said. My voice was quiet, steady, and entirely final. "And I'd like to speak to a fraud investigator." I know that now. Back then, I thought the frost was finally melting. In the months leading up to my engagement with Stellan, Hester changed. The sharp remarks about my unrefined career vanished, replaced by a softness that I hadn't seen since I was small enough to fit in her lap. She started texting me every Tuesday morning. "Thinking of you, Sutton. Hope the Boston wind isn't too cold today." It was a small thing, a digital crumb, but after 30 years of starving for her approval, it tasted like a feast. I began visiting the Newport house more often. We would sit on the back patio, overlooking the peony beds, drinking Earl Grey from the fine bone china. She would ask about Stellan's grandmother's estate in Vermont, his family's philanthropy, and the specific date of my big quarterly review at the firm. I thought she was finally seeing me as a daughter, a peer. In my hunger to be seen, I told her everything. I shared the details of our wedding budget, my promotion bonus, and even the passwords to our joint travel savings because she said she wanted to help me track the best deals for a honeymoon. I didn't realize I was feeding her ammunition. I didn't understand that she wasn't interested in my happiness. She was auditing my world to see exactly where she could build a bridge of dependency. It started small, a Tuesday afternoon in October, just as the leaves were turning that brittle, burnt orange. Hester called, her voice uncharacteristically soft, almost embarrassed. "Sutton, dear, the furnace at the house just gave out. It's $850 for the repair. I'm a little short until my dividend check clears next month. Could you help? Just this once." I felt a rush of pride. I was the pillar. I was the one who could save the day. I wired the money within minutes, looking at my savings account and telling myself that $850 was a small price to pay for a mother's gratitude. I didn't mind the sacrifice because for the first time she called me her savior. But just this once is a dangerous phrase in a family that views responsibility as a weakness to be exploited. Within 6 months, just this once had become every other Tuesday. The financial tether became a permanent fixture, a quiet bleeding that I normalized to keep the peace. I had entered a state of ATM training. I had been conditioned to associate my mother's kindness with my financial utility. If the wire transfer went through, she was sweet. If I questioned a bill, she became fragile and confused, sighing about her age and how Cressida would never be so transactional with family. The ladder of exploitation had 4 distinct rungs. The first was the fixed cost, $600 a month for her various medications that insurance supposedly didn't cover. The second was the secondary cost, $1,200 a month for Cressida's career coaching, which I later discovered was just a recurring membership to an elite Pilates studio and a juice bar in Providence. The third was the emergencies, the roof, the HOA fees, the unexpected plumbing disasters. And the fourth rung, the one that hurt the most, was the silence. Whenever I had a difficult month at work and asked to skip one payment, the Tuesday morning texts stopped. The invitations to tea vanished. The silence was louder than any scream I could have uttered. I would eventually find myself paying just to hear her voice again, effectively purchasing the illusion of a family. I am a risk analyst. I am trained to spot patterns that others ignore. 2 weeks after I walked out of that Newport police station, I sat in my Boston office and did what I should have done years ago. I opened a blank Excel sheet. I didn't title it Family Expenses. I titled it Unrecoverable Assets. I spent 4 hours downloading statements, matching timestamps, and cross-referencing wire transfers. Column A, date. Column B, amount. Column C, recipient. Column D, reason. I saw the $4,200 for a medical procedure that happened on the same day Cressida posted photos from a spa retreat in Sedona. I saw the $12,000 for estate taxes on a house Hester had already sold. Total spent over 48 months. $142. 400. That was my house deposit. That was the security I had worked 60-hour weeks to build. That was the future Hester had stolen from me. One emergency at a time. I felt a cold, crystalline anger settling in my marrow. It wasn't about the money. It was about the fact that she had used my love for her as a map to find my wallet. I remember Hester's last voicemail before I finalized my decision. Sutton, you're so lucky you're so good with money, dear. It's a shame you have to work so hard for it. Unlike Cressida, she just has that natural grace that opens doors. But we're so glad you're there to help us keep the lights on. Let us know when the next transfer clears. It was the ultimate compliment with poison. She was thanking me for the money while reminding me that I would never be the daughter she actually loved. She viewed my competence as a service, not a character trait to be proud of. She didn't want a relationship. She wanted a subscription. I didn't call her. I didn't send an angry email. I simply sat at my desk and opened my bank's business portal. With 3 clicks, I dismantled the bridge. Action, remove authorized user. Hester B. Confirmed. Action, terminate automatic transfer to Newport. HOA. Confirmed. Action, close joint account ending in -4021. Confirmed. The screen flickered white for a second, then went dark. A heavy, rusted weight seemed to lift from my chest. I realized then that I had been the one providing the oxygen for my own suffocation. I had handed them the keys, the ammo, and the blueprints to my life. I had been an architect of my own exploitation because I was afraid of being alone. I didn't know it yet, but the reckoning was coming. Hester was about to find out that when you treat a daughter like a business transaction, you eventually have to face the audit. October 14th. That's when everything cracked open. It was a Saturday, 11:14 p.m. I was driving back to Boston from a site visit in Warwick, my mind already drifting toward the silence of my apartment. The rain was coming down in heavy, relentless sheets, the kind of New England downpour that turns the pavement into a black mirror, swallowing the white lines of the highway. I slowed for a yellow light near the East Greenwich exit. the tires finding a slick patch of oil. Then, the world inverted. There was a sudden violent jolt from behind, the scream of tires fighting wet asphalt followed by the sharp, crystalline sound of a rear window shattering. My head snapped back against the restraint, then surged forward. The air in the cabin was suddenly thick with the smell of hot rubber and the ozone tang of rain-soaked metal. My hazard lights began a rhythmic, mocking click, click, click. I sat there, the sharp sting of the seatbelt biting into my collarbone, watching the blue and red strobes of a cruiser reflect in my side mirror. I wasn't bleeding, but the world felt tilted. Within 10 minutes, a routine exchange of insurance papers turned into a cold, clinical interrogation. The officer, a woman with a tight bun and eyes that had seen 1,000 Saturday night wrecks, stared at her terminal. Her face went still. "Miss Sutton, there's an identity theft flag on this social security number," she said, her voice dropping into a formal, distant tone. "Until we can verify your physical passport and birth certificate, I need you to step out of the vehicle and accompany us to the precinct. It's an administrative hold." It was 11:32 p.m. The sergeant at the precinct told me the weekend administrative lockout would begin at midnight. If I couldn't produce my physical documents to clear the flag by 12 o'clock, I'd be spending the next 48 hours in a holding cell until the federal databases refreshed on Monday morning. I had exactly 28 minutes to bridge the gap between Newport and the station. I had 1 bar of battery left on my phone. I didn't hesitate. I called Hester. She was 20 minutes away, and she had the key to the safe. "Hester, listen to me. I've been in an accident. I'm at the East Greenwich precinct," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline. "There's a flag on my ID. I need you to get the blue folder from the hallway safe and bring it here right now. If you leave in the next 5 minutes, I can go home tonight." In the background, I heard the muffled roar of a television audience. A host was screaming. It was the finale of The Masked Singer. Hester's voice was a thin, annoyed whisper. "Sutton, I am at the most important part of the reveal." "You are always so dramatic," she said, and I could hear the rustle of a snack bag. "You probably just forgot to pay a registration fee. Figure it out yourself. I am not driving in the rain for another one of your emergencies. It's just a few nights. It'll build your character." She hung up. I stared at the black screen of my dead phone, but she didn't just stop there. A few moments later, Sergeant Graham, who was processing my intake, looked up from her own screen. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and professional disgust. "Is this your mother?" she asked, turning her monitor slightly. Hester had posted to the Newport B family group thread, a screenshot of my missed call highlighted. "Hester, Sutton is in trouble with the police again, probably trying to get me to pay for her car. I'm ignoring it to watch the finale. Hashburton. Cressida. Just seen this. She probably did it on purpose to ruin Mom's night." Sergeant Graham reached into her drawer and handed me a charger cord and a yellow legal pad. "I saw that," she said quietly, her voice the first warm thing I had felt in hours. "Take photos of that thread. Keep every timestamp. You're going to need them when you decide who you really are." I didn't break. I didn't beg. I sat on that wooden bench and went to work. I logged into my insurance portal on a precinct computer. Police report number, RI, 2025 9942. ER intake form, #881A, refusal of transport. I documented the cold fact. I was a risk analyst who had just identified the biggest liability in my life, and she shared my last name. I didn't call Hester back. I called a private legal courier service in Boston. I paid $2,500 for a bonded agent to drive my spare key to my Boston apartment, retrieve my backup documents from my personal vault, and race them down to Newport. Triple rate, worth every penny. I spent the night on a cold bench, the smell of floor wax and old coffee my only companions. But when the sun came up, I had the paperwork that proved I existed. Around 4 a.m., Stellan arrived. He had been out of town, but the second he saw my one-word text before my phone died, he had driven 3 hours through the storm. He didn't bring flowers, he brought a manila envelope. He sat next to me on the bench, his coat dripping on the linoleum. "Sutton," he whispered, his voice thick with a different kind of fatigue. "I spent the night digging through the old boxes you kept from the move. I found a scan of your 2006 Providence Memorial Hospital records. The ones from your childhood surgery. He slid a paper toward me. I looked at the clinical lines, the blood type, the donor compatibility notes. I am a woman of logic, but what I saw made the air leave my lungs. The blood type on my birth record, the one Hester had filed, didn't match the medical file from the hospital. Not even close. The numbers. They didn't match Hester at all. I hadn't been forgotten by my family. I'd been meticulously managed under a false identity. I walked out of that station at 9 a.m. on Sunday morning. My collarbone throbbed and my head felt like it was full of glass shards. A stranger from a courier service had driven through a deluge to bring me my papers. Stellan had stayed up all night to find my truth. My mother had stayed on her sofa to watch a man in a goldfish mask. Strangers showed up. My family didn't. I looked at the gray Newport sky and realized the audit wasn't just about money anymore. It was about a secret Hester had been hiding for 20 years. As I walked to Stellan's car, I knew that the version of Sutton they had spent decades belittling was dead. The woman standing in the rain was someone they weren't prepared for. On Monday morning, at 6:45 a.m., I returned to my Boston apartment and sat by the window as a thick gray fog rolled down from the Charles River like a heavy velvet curtain. The pungent smell of hospital disinfectant still lingered on the wool coat draped over the chair, but the bruises on my collarbone from the seatbelt had turned a dull yellow. There were no alarms, no sirens. Only the gentle hum of the refrigerator, and the air in the room truly belonged to me. I looked at my reflection in the dark screen of my laptop. For 30 years, I had been an architect of other people's comfort, trying to buy a seat at a family table where I was only invited to serve the food. I thought about the police station bench. I thought about Hester's voice through the phone, choosing a man in a goldfish mask over her daughter's existence. Keep paying, or stop bleeding. The choice was that simple. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is a volatile asset. It burns out and leaves you vulnerable. I was an analyst and I had just identified a terminal liability in my life's portfolio. It was time to rebalance the books. I opened my banking portal. For years, the list of recurring transfers had looked like a digital ledger of my worth in Hester's eyes. Automatic transfer, Newport mortgage. Assistance, $3,200. Automatic transfer, Cressida B. Personal allowance, $1,500. Direct debit, Newport Country Club. Dues, $450. They stared back at me like a schedule of exploitation. I realized that my mother would notice the money was gone long before she noticed I was. I had been providing the oxygen for my own suffocation, and it was time to cut the line. My fingers didn't shake. I treated the screen like a risk mitigation report, ticking off the items with clinical precision. Terminate Newport mortgage assistance. Confirm. Revoke secondary user access. Hester B. Confirm. Deactivate Cressida's emergency credit card. Confirm. Enable two-factor authentication on all wealth management accounts. Confirm. Mute family group chat. Newport B family. Indefinitely. There was no dramatic music, no shouting matches, just the soft, rhythmic click of my mouse and the silent update of a database. I felt $140,000 worth of generational guilt simply evaporate into the ether. The silence didn't hurt. It healed. I wasn't just cutting them off. I was taking my life back into my own legal custody. I haven't been forgotten by them. I have finally erased their access to the version of me they thought they owned. Stellan came over at noon with a bag of groceries and a hard drive. He didn't ask me to forgive and move on, or tell me that she's still your mother. He just sat at the kitchen table and opened a file. "Sutton," he said, his voice firm as a pillar in the quiet room. "I've spoken to Thorne. We're not just looking at your identifying features anymore. We're looking at why Hester is so afraid of the DNA test results being made public. I'm not the one bearing all the burden. I'm protected by a family I chose, not one I inherited." That afternoon, my phone lit up with a notification from Instagram. Cressida had posted a save the date for her Impulse Bachelorette party. Same city, same day, same guest list as mine. It was a classic move from her playbook, forcing our mutual friends to choose. hoping I'd be left standing in an empty room while she was showered with attention. I didn't call her. I didn't send a frantic screenshot to our aunts or plead for loyalty. I called my wedding planner instead. "Cancel my bachelorette party," I said. My voice was calm, devoid of the tremor she expected. "Take that $5,000 deposit and move it to a different line item. Private security. I want a bonded, plainclothes team at the oceanfront mansion for the wedding. No name on the guest list, no entry, no exceptions." Thorne arrived an hour later. He placed a black silk folder on my desk. Not an invitation, but a dossier. Inside were the 2006 Providence Memorial Hospital records Stellan had flagged. Thorne looked at me with a grim sort of respect, the kind one professional gives another. "Hester thinks she's playing a game of emotions, Sutton," he said quietly. "She doesn't realize she's entered a court of facts. We've saved you a seat at the table she's been trying to burn down for 20 years. I ran my fingers over the embossed seal on the folder. I knew the fallout was coming. Hester and Cressida would notice the lack of funds within 48 hours. They would scream, they would smear my name, and they would try to reclaim the narrative. But I was no longer negotiating with people who didn't love me. I thought the silence would be the hardest part of this journey. But as I looked at the Providence files, I realized that the loudest sound in the world is the truth finally being told. I didn't expect what Thorne would find in the vault next, but I knew I was finally the one holding the compass. 3 weeks remained until the wedding. My Boston apartment had never been quieter. My name is Sutton, and for the first time in my 31 years, the silence of my home didn't feel like a vacuum waiting to be filled by someone else's emergency. I woke up at 6 a.m. to the familiar domestic whistle of the kettle and the soft, rhythmic thud of the morning paper hitting the hallway door. There were no frantic phone calls about overdue mortgage payments for a house I didn't own. There were no texts from Cressida demanding a wire transfer for a spiritual reset in Tulum. My home felt like a sanctuary, clean, deliberate, and entirely mine. Every object, from the hand-thrown ceramic mugs to the linen napkins, was a choice I had made for myself, not a peace offering bought to pacify Hester's vanity. A clean room is a form of self-respect. It's a statement that your space is no longer a staging ground for other people's chaos. But the ache was still there, a dull, phantom pressure situated right beneath my fifth rib. It usually surfaced when I looked at the reception seating chart pinned to my drafting board. I would stare at the bride's family table, a vast white desert on the digital map. I found myself counting the forks as I set the table for two, a muscle memory habit from years of ensuring every guest was satisfied before I ever dared to sit down. I still caught the scent of Hester's perfume in the smell of certain lilies at the florist. I was safe, but as a risk analyst, I knew I was simply in the eye of the storm. I haven't been forgotten by them. I've been erased from their ledger because I am no longer an asset they can leverage. The bridge between my quiet new life and the coming collision arrived via a phone call. It was Aunt Vera, Hester's oldest friend and the only woman in Newport who had ever looked at me without checking my pedigree first. Her voice through the speaker was a strained, tactical whisper. "Sutton? I wasn't sure if I should call, but you need to know. Your mother is at the country club every day. She's telling everyone you've had a collapse after your accident. She's showing people old medical records from when you were 6, claiming you've always been confused. She's planning something for the wedding day, Sutton. She's telling the Polson cousins that you aren't who you claim to be." I didn't feel the familiar spike of panic. I felt a cold, humming energy, the kind you feel when a calculated risk begins to manifest. "Thank you, Vera," I said. "I'm not confused. I'm just finished." I hung up and stood in the center of my foyer. I paced the length of the hallway. 6 steps forward, 6 steps back. I didn't reach for a glass of water. I didn't call Stellan. I simply waited. 60 seconds of absolute silence. Then, it happened. Thursday morning. 10:07 a.m., 3 sharp, heavy knocks. I checked the peephole. It took me 4 seconds to process the man standing on my landing, and 2 seconds to realize the axis of my world was tilting again. He didn't look like Newport society. He was tall, wearing a charcoal wool suit that projected a level of authority that made my heart rate slow down into a focused rhythm. He held a leather briefcase like a seasoned officer holds a sidearm. I opened the door. The man, Thorne, didn't offer a handshake or a polite smile. He stepped into the foyer with a measured gait and placed a heavy manila folder on my console table. The folder was bound with a lead-colored security seal and a date stamped in faded red ink. I looked down at the label. October 14th, 2006. Providence Memorial Hospital. Pediatric ward. Sealed by court order. Thorne looked at me with eyes that had clearly spent decades looking through the smoke and mirrors of probate law. Miss Sutton? I've been holding this file for 20 years, waiting for that social security flag I planted to be triggered by a document request. Your mother, or the woman you call Hester, thinks she's bringing a DNA test to ruin your wedding. She thinks she's holding a gift that will erase you. He paused, the silence in the hallway becoming a physical weight. She doesn't realize she's bringing the final piece of evidence to a federal fraud case I've been building since before you could drive. She thinks the secret is buried in your blood. It's actually buried in the hospital's intake ledger. I stared at the red wax seal on the folder. My name was typed on the label in a font from a different era, but next to it was a series of medical identification numbers that didn't match a single record Hester had ever shown me. 5 seconds of measured silence. In that moment, I realized that the identity theft flag from the police station wasn't a mistake. It was a beacon. It was a message from my past self, or someone who loved me enough to protect me from a distance of 20 years. Thorne straightened his coat and turned toward the door. Don't bother inviting her, Sutton, but don't worry if she shows up. I've reviewed your security plan for the oceanfront mansion. At that event, the facts will finally be allowed to speak, and I suspect Hester isn't going to like what they have to say. I gripped the edge of the dark wood console table until my knuckles turned a bloodless white. I wasn't the burden. I wasn't the sensitive daughter who couldn't manage her life. I was the evidence of a 20-year-old crime. As I watched Thorne walk toward the elevator, I realized that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. The stage was set. The jury was waiting. And I finally held the only folder that mattered: 4 a.m., the wedding morning. While Newport slept under a thick blanket of Atlantic fog, I was sitting at the mahogany desk in my hotel suite, the blue light of my laptop reflecting in my glasses. I wasn't looking at floral arrangements or rehearsal videos. I was looking at bank statements, archived emails, and the 2006 Providence Memorial records that Thorne had provided. The laser printer in the corner whirred, spitting out pages that were still warm to the touch. I organized them chronologically. Black binder, white heavy-duty dividers, color-coded tabs, financial extraction, identity discrepancies, crisis refusals. I felt the slight tremor in my hands as I snapped the rings of the binder shut, but I didn't stop. I wasn't preparing to win a fight. I was preparing so that the narrative of my life could never be stolen from me again. In a room full of people who value appearances, a dossier is the only language that remains untranslated. Stellan sat across from me, his tuxedo jacket draped over a chair, a cup of black coffee between his hands. He flipped through the financial section, his jaw tightening as he reached the final tally. $362,000 over 5 years, Sutton, he whispered. And she told everyone at the country club you were a financial burden who couldn't even manage a car payment. He looked at me, his eyes steady, a true anchor in the coming tide. Don't say a word to her. Let the paper do the talking today. You've carried the weight of their lies for 20 years. Now let the ink carry the proof. I didn't reply. I simply felt a hollow, crystalline peace. I had stopped negotiating with the storm. By 10 a.m., my phone began to buzz in the bridal suite. It was a text from my cousin Chloe. Hester is already here. She's telling everyone you've had a nervous collapse after the accident and that this wedding is just a cover for your breakdown. People are looking at the seating chart and whispering, Sutton. She's using terms like erratic and confused. Be ready. I closed the message without responding. It was a classic preemptive strike, gaslighting a social circle to discredit the witness before she ever takes the stand. I haven't been forgotten. I have been meticulously edited out of my own story so that Hester could remain the hero. 1 p.m. oceanfront villa. The venue was a fortress of limestone and crystal, perched precariously above the gray Atlantic Ocean. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of white lilies, and the salty, cold taste of the sea. A string quartet played Vivaldi music, the notes sharp and fragile as glass. 500 guests, the Newport jury, sipped fine champagne under chandeliers hanging like a shower of ice. I entered the ballroom, my white silk dress sweeping the ground behind me. I wasn't carrying a bouquet. I held a black bound notebook, clutched tightly to my side like a shield. I felt the gazes. Not gazes of admiration, but gazes of heavy, suffocating pity. Hester had briefed the jury. I saw her near the altar, a glass of Chardonnay in one hand, and a practiced look of maternal concern etched into her face. She approached me as I neared the front row, her perfume, a heavy, cloying floral, reaching me before her voice did. "Sutton, darling," she cooed, her voice loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear. "Are you sure you're feeling well enough for this? You look so fragile today. Perhaps we should sit you down before you have another one of your episodes." I didn't blink. I didn't let the heat rise to my face. I looked her directly in the eye and spoke with a level of detachment that seemed to startle her. "I am perfectly fine, Mrs. Hester. Please take your seat. We have a schedule to maintain." The drop of her smile was a silent satisfaction. The use of Mrs. Hester instead of Mom was an administrative boundary, a verbal fence that stripped her of her authority in front of the Newport elite. It wasn't an insult. It was a classification. But the silence didn't last. The heavy oak doors at the back of the hall swung open with a dull thud. 2 Newport police officers in crisp blue uniforms stepped in, their leather belts creaking in the sudden, vacuum-sealed quiet of the room. Hester turned to the crowd, her hand flying to her throat in a performative gesture of shock. "Wait! I cannot sit by and let this fraud continue!" she cried, her voice rising to a shrill, rehearsed shriek. She marched toward the altar, pulling a sealed envelope from her designer bag. Her final gift. She threw it onto the communion table next to my binder. "This is the DNA result. Sutton is not my daughter. She's an orphan who stole my dead child's identity 20 years ago to worm her way into this family's wealth. She's a criminal, and I've brought the police here to end this lie once and for all." The room suddenly fell into a terrifying murmur. The guests, my jury, began to back away, creating a physical distance between me and the rest of the world. I saw the pity on their faces turn into cold, sharp judgment. Hester looked triumphant, his hand on the shoulder of the leading officer. In the front row, I saw Stellan's father, the judge. He looked at my file, then at me. He nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly. He was waiting for the truth to be revealed. The judge stood up to calm the room, to perhaps ask for order or a private conversation. But Hester was faster. She lunged for the podium microphone, the screech of feedback piercing the air like a knife. "Before anyone says another word!" she yelled into the mic, her eyes wild with a terrifying sense of entitlement. "The family needs to know the full extent of this girl's deception. Since her accident, she's been erratic, confused, a danger to herself. This isn't a wedding, it's an intervention." She paused, her chest heaving, gripping the microphone as if it were a newly regained strength. I stood in the middle of the auditorium, my documents in hand, as Thorne emerged from the shadows of the back row. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't shout. He simply walked down the aisle, Hester looking as if she wanted to disappear. Judgment Day was just a breath away. The oceanfront mansion was a cathedral of light and lies. Crystal chandeliers shivered under the salt breeze drifting through the open terrace doors, and the air was heavy with the scent of expensive lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of the Atlantic. Hester stood at the mahogany podium, the microphone clutched in her hand like a scepter of reclaimed authority. I stood 5 feet away in my white silk, a silent spectator at my own public execution. I didn't reach for the mic. I didn't cry. I simply watched the condensation drip down a glass of champagne on a nearby tray, my hands folded across the black binder. I haven't been forgotten by this room. I have been positioned as the villain in a play I never auditioned for. Hester leaned into the mic, her voice cracking with a perfectly practiced tremor that had fooled Newport for 2 decades. "I have sacrificed everything for this girl," she told the 500 guests, her eyes glistening under the spotlights. "I carried her through her instability. I funded her life when she was confused and erratic. And this is the thanks I get? A secret wedding and a cold shoulder? She turned to the police officers, her gesture broad and theatrical. She is an imposter. She stole the identity of my child who passed away 20 years ago just to secure a trust fund she didn't earn. She belongs in the cell she visited last Saturday. The room went vacuum sealed. 500 people, the Newport elite I had spent my life trying to prove my worth to, stared at me with a mixture of horror and predatory curiosity. I didn't correct her. I didn't tell them about the $3,200 monthly mortgage payments I'd made for a house she'd already sold. I just looked at the way her diamond earring caught the light, noting the exact moment her entitlement transitioned into a trap of her own construction. The silence in the room was a physical weight, but I held it, using my im-lang as a pressure cooker for the truth. The lead officer stepped toward me, the leather of his holster creaking. I didn't flinch. I looked at his badge and asked one question, my voice as level as a horizon line. "Officer, does your warrant cover the person named on that DNA test, or the person who filed the fraudulent birth certificate in 2006? Before he could answer, a voice cut through the ballroom from the back row. Cold. Authoritative. Final. "I believe I can clear that up," Thorne said, stepping into the center aisle. He walked toward the altar with the unhurried gait of a man who already knew the verdict. He placed the sealed 2006 Providence file next to Hester's gift DNA results and looked at her, really looked at her, and called her by a name that made her face go the color of ash. "Hello, Loretta," Thorne said quietly. The ledger of truth began to fall like a hammer, and I stood by as the numbers replaced the narrative. Thorne opened the file and began to read with clinical precision. October 14th, 2006. A child was reported deceased in the Providence Pediatric Ward. October 15th, 2006. A forged discharge paper was filed under the name Sutton to ensure the continuation of a $4.2 million family trust. Total extraction, $362,400 diverted from the trust into secondary offshore accounts over the last 60 months. The DNA evidence, Hester's gift, proved I wasn't her biological daughter, but Thorne's medical ledger proved why. Because Hester had swapped an abandoned infant into that hospital bed 20 years ago to keep the inheritance flowing after her own child had passed. Thorne turned the binder to the final page, a printout of a message Hester had sent to Cressida just 4 hours before the ceremony. "If she doesn't pay for the Mediterranean cruise by tonight, I'm nuking the wedding. I'll tell the cops she's a fraud. If I don't get the money, nobody gets the girl." There was no emoji this time. Just the cold, digital evidence of a woman selling a life for a vacation. The golden child, Cressida, took a sharp step back, her eyes darting to the exit as she realized the payroll had officially been terminated. I stepped to the microphone. The room was so quiet I could hear the officers' handcuffs clinking as they reached for Hester's wrists. I looked at the woman who had defined my existence as a burden and felt nothing but a strange, crystalline peace. "I didn't come here to ruin you, Hester," I said, my voice carrying to the very back of the hall without strain. "I came here to marry a man who knows my actual name, even if you never cared to learn it. You spent 20 years treating me like an unrecoverable asset. You calculated my worth in car notes and country club dues. But you forgot one thing. An analyst always balances the books eventually. This isn't an intervention. This is an audit, and your account is officially bankrupt. That's the boundary." The reaction was a silent chain. The crowd didn't gasp. They simply stepped back, a sea of Newport silk and wool closing Hester out. They turned their shoulders away from her, shifting their gaze to the floor or the ceiling. Anywhere but at the fraud they had invited to their tables for years. Even Cressida slipped into the shadows, deleting her social media history in real time. I set the binder down on the podium. I reached for Stellan's hand, feeling the warmth of a person who saw me as a human being, not a transaction. I watched the police lead Hester through the gold leaf doors, her silk dress rustling against the marble floor one last time. The axis of my world had shifted. The version of me that lived for their approval was gone. And as the doors closed, I realized I was finally the only one who knew exactly who I was. The oceanfront mansion didn't fall down when the police led Hester away. It just went cold. There was no thunderous applause, no cinematic grand finale. Only the hollow, terrifying sound of 500 people trying to remember how to breathe in a room built on a foundation of forgery. The string quartet had stopped playing halfway through the arrest, their bows frozen in midair like jagged glass. I stood at the altar, Stellan's hand a steady, grounding weight in mine, watching my family dissolve. People didn't walk toward me to offer congratulations or comfort. They drifted away, their eyes fixed on the limestone floor as if the truth were too bright to look at directly. The Newport elite, the jury Hester had meticulously groomed for decades, didn't stay to fight for her. They simply adjusted their silk ties, reached for their wool coats, and exited into the Atlantic fog. I wasn't the burden anymore. I was the witness to a crime they had all inadvertently invited to dinner. Cressida was the first to disappear, slipping through the side exit without a single backward glance, her social media accounts already being scrubbed of our shared history. Aunt Vera approached me near the heavy oak doors, her hand trembling as she touched my arm. "I didn't know, Sutton," she whispered. It was a decade too late for a sorry, but for the first time in my life, she used my name without a sigh or a note of disappointment. The hierarchy hadn't just broken, it had been audited out of existence. 1 month later, the Newport house was sealed with yellow police tape, a team of forensic accountants tearing through the mahogany-lined study where Hester used to count her social capital. Hester's messages came through her court-appointed attorney. Bitter, jagged things that arrived like shrapnel in my inbox. "You disgraced the Brennan name. You ruined your sister's prospects. How could you do this to your own mother?" There was no apology for the 2006 swap, no remorse for the police at the altar, and no recognition of the infant she had abandoned to keep a trust fund alive. There was only the desperate, frantic need to reclaim the narrative. I didn't reply. I didn't send screenshots of the ledger or Thorne's evidence. I simply turned the phone face down and listened to the rhythmic rain against my Boston window. Closing that door wasn't an act of war. It was an act of hygiene. A week after the final trial ended, I sat on the gray sand of a Rhode Island beach with Stellan. The air was salty and real, carrying the strong scent of wedding lilies. I opened my laptop one last time, the battery nearly dead. I found the folder titled Hester B. Finances. I wiped out every PDF file, every medical report from Providence, and every spreadsheet detailing my stolen years, then pressed delete. I cried then, not for my deceased mother, but for the shame of having loved someone who treated me like an irretrievable asset. And then, as the waves receded, the crying stopped. After 31 years, my heart no longer felt like an overdrafted account. I signed the final papers Thorne had sent me, documents that formally renounced any claim to the Newport Trust or the name attached to it. I was choosing to be a stranger to their history, so I could be the architect of my own. I no longer needed their eyes to see me to know that I existed. My value was no longer calculated in mortgage payments or the portrait I could provide for someone else's vanity. To anyone still carrying a weight that was never yours to bear, you are allowed to put it down. You are allowed to walk away from a table where love is served as a debt. As I walked back to the car with Stellan, I didn't look back at the mansion on the cliff. The world didn't collapse when the truth came out. It just changed direction.